If you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who wants to know what's actually going on in the world, the really important stuff, without drowning in a sea of headlines, right?
Exactly. We want to get beyond those surface level reports and really dig into the events shaping our world.
Yeah, make sense of it all, see how things connect. And that's exactly what we're doing today in this deep dive. We're going to tackle three big stories that have been dominating the news lately: the situation in Turkey, the devastating conflict in Gaza, and, well, former President Trump is never far from the headlines, so we'll look at some of his recent actions, too, with Ukraine and all that.
It's been, let's just say, a busy news cycle.
To say the least, we've been poring over reports, articles, statements, you name it, trying to get a clearer picture of these complex events.
Because, just reading a few headlines doesn't really cut it.
No, it really doesn't. So let's start with Turkey. Things have been, well, pretty explosive there since the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu.
Yeah, huge development and potentially a game changer for Turkish politics. I mean,
Right.
this isn't just some random city official. Imamoglu was seen by many as the most likely person to challenge President Erdogan in the next election. And the timing of this arrest, right when he was expected to be named the presidential candidate for the CHP, the main opposition party, well, it's certainly raising eyebrows.
For sure. And the charges against him are serious stuff, like really serious. Forming a criminal organization, taking bribes, extortion, even unlawfully handling personal data.
It's quite a list.
It is. And of course, Imamoglu says it's all completely fabricated, a political witch hunt. But this arrest has, well, it's lit a fire under the Turkish public.
Absolutely. We've seen massive protests, the kind we haven't seen in Turkey for years. People are furious, and the response from the authorities has been, let's just say, heavy-handed. Water cannons, pepper spray, hundreds of arrests. It's getting pretty ugly out there.
Yeah, definitely not a good look for a country that, claims to be a democracy.
Right. And Erdogan, who's been in power for over 2 decades, has actually condemned the protests. He's accusing the CHP, the opposition party, of trying to, stir up trouble and destabilize the country.
It's a pretty familiar playbook.
It is. And it's important to remember that Erdogan can't run again in 2028 unless they change the constitution. So, in theory, the field is wide open.
And that's probably why this arrest feels so calculated. The timing is just too perfect right before the CHP was going to officially select Imamoglu as their candidate.
It's hard not to see it that way. Now, the Ministry of Justice is insisting that the judiciary is independent, that there's no political interference going on. But, well, a lot of people are skeptical.
To put it mildly. But here's something interesting. Even with their main guy in jail, the CHP went ahead with their nomination process anyway.
Defiant, huh?
Yeah, and they're claiming a huge turnout, even non-party members voting to show their support. Of course, those numbers are difficult to verify independently, but it definitely shows that the opposition isn't backing down.
Right. And technically, just being arrested doesn't prevent Imamoglu from running for president.
No?
He has to actually be convicted. So, yeah, this situation is still very fluid.
It's a real cliffhanger. But there's more to this story than just the arrest and the protests. We've also seen some really concerning developments online. X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. They've been fighting back against Turkish court orders to block hundreds of accounts.
Yeah, accounts belonging to politicians, journalists, activists, the whole shebang.
Exactly. And X is arguing that, blocking these accounts is basically censorship. It's preventing people from accessing news and engaging in political debate.
And that's a slippery slope. Where do you draw the line? It's a fundamental question about freedom of expression in the digital age.
And then you've got Istanbul University, which just announced that they're revoking Imamoglu's degree, claiming some kind of irregularities.
Oh, well, so now they're going after his education.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And to be a presidential candidate in Turkey, you have to have a university degree. So if they actually take his degree away, that could be it for him.
That's a big if, though. He's definitely going to appeal this. His lawyers have already said so. So, yeah, another thing to watch closely.
It does feel like they're trying to hit him from every angle, doesn't it?
It does. And the prosecutors even considered charging him with aiding an armed terrorist organization.
Whoa, hold on. What?
Yeah, they were looking into alleged connections between the pro-Kurdish Dem Party and the PKK, which is a designated terrorist group in Turkey. But the court decided not to pursue that charge, at least for now.
Okay, so just to be clear, the PKK is the Kurdistan Workers' Party. They've been fighting the Turkish government for like decades.
Right, it's a long and bloody conflict. It's worth noting, though, that the PKK actually declared a ceasefire back in March. So the timing of this potential charge against Imamoglu, it seems a bit suspicious, to say the least.
Very much so. So yeah, when you put it all together, the arrests, the charges, the protests, the online censorship, the degree thing, it's no wonder that a lot of people see this as a coordinated effort to take down a major political rival.
It's hard to argue with that. It really exposes those deep political fault lines running through Turkish society.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about the situation in Gaza, which is, well, it's just heartbreaking.
Tragic. There's really no other word for it. The humanitarian crisis there is getting worse by the day.
The scale of the human suffering is almost incomprehensible. According to the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, over 50,000 Palestinians have been killed since the Israeli military operation began. That's over 2% of Gaza's pre-war population. And we're talking about over 113,000 injured as well.
Is an absolute catastrophe. And those numbers, while widely used by the UN and other international organizations, are actually disputed by Israel.
Right, and it's incredibly difficult to get an accurate picture of what's happening on the ground because Israel severely restricts access for independent journalists.
It's a black box, basically.
And that just makes it even harder to know what's really going on and who to believe. But even if we take those numbers with a grain of salt, it's undeniable that the human cost of this conflict is immense.
Absolutely. And another disturbing fact is that the reported death tolls don't distinguish between civilians and fighters. But a UN analysis from a few months ago found that nearly 70% of the verified victims were women and children.
That's horrifying.
It is. And a study published in The Lancet suggested that the actual number of deaths could be much higher than what's being reported. So yeah, the true scale of this tragedy is probably even worse than we know.
This whole nightmare, as you know, was triggered by that Hamas attack on Israel back in October.
Right, a truly horrific event. Over 1,200 people were killed and more than 250 taken hostage.
And Israel responded with this massive military operation, which has led to the devastation we're seeing in Gaza now.
Right, and just in the past day, the health ministry has reported dozens more deaths, bringing the total, since Israel resumed their offensive earlier this week, to a really alarming number.
It's just relentless. And Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, he's been very clear about their objectives. He said they're going to seize additional areas in Gaza and basically keep going until all the hostages are returned, both the living and the dead.
He even threatened permanent occupation of parts of Gaza if the hostages aren't released.
Which, you know, is a huge deal. That would basically change the whole map of the region.
Yeah, a major escalation. Now, Katz did mention a U.S. proposal, apparently put forward by Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, for a two-stage hostage release with a ceasefire in between.
Which Israel has agreed to.
Supposedly, yes. But there's another element to this that's even more controversial. Katz also said that Israel would implement U.S. President Trump's voluntary transfer plan for Gaza residents.
Voluntary transfer. That sounds a bit euphemistic.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The details of this plan are pretty vague, but any talk of moving people out of Gaza against their will is a huge red flag under international law.
Yeah, especially considering how many people in Gaza are already displaced. It's a very sensitive issue.
Absolutely. And speaking of sensitive issues, there's also the matter of the Israeli strike on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis.
Oh, right. That was awful.
Israel says they targeted a key Hamas member based on extensive intelligence and used precise munitions to avoid collateral damage.
But the Hamas-run health ministry reported that many other people were injured, including medical staff, and the hospital itself was badly damaged.
Yeah, a whole department had to be evacuated.
It's just tragic, and Israel has repeatedly accused Hamas of using hospitals as shields, you know, hiding among civilians.
Which Hamas denies, of course.
Of course. And in another incident, another Hamas leader, Salah al-Bardawil, was killed in a separate Israeli airstrike. All of this happening while there are reports of, you know, dozens of other deaths in Khan Yunis and Rafah. It's just, it's relentless.
The intensity of the fighting is really escalating. And it's important to remember that Israel resumed this military operation on March 18th after a 2-month pause in the fighting.
Right, so there was a ceasefire, but it broke down.
Exactly. Israel blames Hamas, saying they rejected a U.S. proposal to extend the truce. Hamas, on the other hand, says Israel had already abandoned the terms of the original agreement from January. So,
yeah,
classic blame game.
It never ends, and unfortunately, the negotiations for a new ceasefire seem to be going nowhere.
Yeah, stalled. Deadlocked. And the humanitarian situation in Gaza is just spiraling out of control. The UN has described it as, and I quote, gravely, gravely concerning, with absolutely desperate tragedies occurring all over Gaza.
It's hard to even imagine what it's like for the people trapped in that situation.
It's truly dire. And while both Israel and the U.S. are accusing Hamas of refusing to extend the ceasefire, Hamas insists that they're engaging with the mediators in good faith.
But the acting U.S. ambassador to the UN has put the blame squarely on Hamas, saying that every single death could have been avoided if they had just accepted the proposed agreement.
Yeah, pretty strong words.
They are. And it certainly doesn't help the already tense atmosphere surrounding these negotiations.
Right. Now, Hamas has denied that they're the ones stalling the talks. They say they're committed to working with the mediators to secure a prisoner exchange, an end to the military offensive, and a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
So they're basically saying they want everything.
Pretty much. And to make matters even worse, Israel blocked food, fuel, and medical supplies from entering Gaza at the beginning of March.
They're saying Hamas is commandeering those supplies.
That's their claim.
Yeah.
But they haven't provided any evidence to back it up. And regardless of who's to blame, this blockade is just making a terrible situation even worse.
It's adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And we've seen this before. Israeli evacuation orders causing panic and mass displacement of Palestinian families.
It's a recurring nightmare for those people.
Mm.
And both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have made it clear that Gaza is not for sale. They're rejecting any kind of forced displacement.
And the UN has also warned against it, saying it would violate international law and could even be considered ethnic cleansing.
So, yeah, a very volatile and complex situation with no easy answers.
Okay, let's move on now to the U.S. and former President Trump. He might be out of office, but he's definitely not out of the headlines.
Never. And one of his recent moves has been causing quite a stir, revoking security clearances for a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, this was a pretty big deal. We're talking about some pretty prominent figures, including his old rivals, Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton.
Right, but it wasn't just them. Trump went after a lot of former officials and people who've criticized him.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what his end game is.
It does. He even formally confirmed that he's revoking President Biden's security clearance, something he'd announced before, and extended that to any other member of the Biden family.
Wow, going after the whole family.
Yeah, it's pretty unprecedented. In his official statement, Trump said it's no longer in the national interest for these people to have access to classified information.
Which is a break from the usual practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Normally, former presidents and top officials keep their security clearances so they can be consulted on national security matters.
Exactly. And this order from Trump specifically tells government agencies to prevent these people from accessing secure facilities.
So no more classified briefings, no access to sensitive information, even if it's related to their previous work.
Right. And the list of people affected is pretty long and includes a mix of current and former officials, Republicans, and Democrats. You've got key figures in the Biden administration like Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Lisa Monaco.
He's also going after people from his own administration who testified against him during the impeachment hearings, like Fiona Hill and Alexander Vindman.
And don't forget prominent Republicans who've been critical of him, like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger.
He even included some of his legal adversaries, like Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, and Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney.
So yeah, a pretty wide net, and
Yeah.
the implications of these revocations are different for everyone. For some, it's probably mostly symbolic.
Right. But for people like James and Bragg, who are actively involved in legal cases against Trump, this could make it harder for them to access information they might need, even if the connection isn't immediately obvious.
And then there's Mark Zaid, the lawyer who represents whistleblowers. He's on the list too, but he says he hasn't even received formal notification.
So, a bit of a mess, administratively speaking.
It does seem that way. And as you might expect, a lot of the people targeted by these revocations have been pretty vocal in their criticism of Trump.
They're not holding back.
Nope. And Trump, in his defense, has said he's just doing what Biden did to him back in 2021.
Remember that.
Yeah.
Biden limited Trump's access to intelligence briefings after he left office, saying he was concerned about Trump's, let's say, unpredictable behavior.
So basically, tit for tat.
Seems like it. And it's a complicated issue. You know, there are arguments to be made on both sides about whether these revocations are justified and what the potential consequences might be.
And let's not forget that Biden himself had some issues with classified documents earlier this year.
Right. A Justice Department report found that he'd kept some classified documents from his time as vice president, but they said he cooperated with the investigation.
And of course, there was that whole indictment against Trump himself for mishandling classified documents.
Which was later dismissed. But yeah, it all adds to the, let's call it the murkiness of the situation.
Okay, let's shift gears one more time and talk about Ukraine. Former President Trump has been getting involved in those peace talks, and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, has been making some interesting statements.
Yeah, Witkoff has been leading the U.S. delegation in those ceasefire negotiations involving Ukraine and Russia. And he's been sounding pretty optimistic lately, saying he thinks Putin actually wants peace and that he expects real progress to be made.
But the Kremlin has been pouring cold water on that optimism. Their spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said they're only at the beginning of this path.
Yeah, so maybe not as much progress as Witkoff is suggesting.
And meanwhile, the fighting in Ukraine continues. President Zelensky has called on Putin to stop the Russian invasions, especially after those heavy drone strikes on Kiev.
It seems Russia has some conditions they want met before they'll agree to that 30-day ceasefire proposed by the U.S. and accepted by Ukraine.
So those preconditions are probably a major obstacle right now.
Most likely. Now, the U.S. and Ukraine have been meeting in Riyadh, focusing on things like protecting energy facilities and critical infrastructure in Ukraine.
Which have been repeatedly targeted by Russia.
Right. They've also been talking about potentially reopening those Black Sea shipping lanes and reviving that grain export deal.
And that might involve easing some of the sanctions against Russia?
Possibly. But President Trump has said he wants a quick end to this war.
Which is understandable, but despite the fact that the U.S. hasn't been able to get Russia to agree to a ceasefire so far, the Trump administration doesn't seem to be putting much public pressure on them.
It's a delicate balancing act. And some of the things Steve Witkoff has been saying have actually raised eyebrows among U.S. allies.
He's been echoing some of the talking points we've heard from the Kremlin.
Yeah, in a recent interview, Witkoff said some pretty provocative things. He suggested that Ukraine is a false country and that Russia was provoked into this conflict. He even said he thinks Putin is a trustworthy negotiator.
That's quite a statement.
It is. And he also dismissed a plan from the UK's Prime Minister Starmer for a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, calling it a posture and a pose.
So, yeah, a pretty significant departure from the stance of many European countries.
It is. And Witkoff even repeated some specific arguments we've heard from the Russian government. He questioned when the occupied territories in Ukraine would be recognized as belonging to Russia and said the root cause of the war was Russia's belief that Ukraine is a made-up country, along with their territorial claims going back to World War II.
But he got some of the facts wrong, right?
He did. He misidentified some of the regions that Russia has annexed or partially occupied and wrongly claimed that there were referendums with overwhelming support for Russian rule in all of those areas.
Those referendums were pretty controversial, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
International observers widely criticized them and said they weren't legitimate. And Witkoff also made a false claim about Ukrainian troops being surrounded in Kursk.
So, yeah, some factual inaccuracies there.
There were. But despite those errors, Witkoff went on to talk about how he sees the U.S. and Russia cooperating in the future on things like energy, shipping, and even AI.
He's envisioning a pretty cozy relationship.
He is. And he said a ceasefire in the Black Sea is coming soon and that a full 30-day ceasefire is within reach.
So a lot of optimism there, even though the situation on the ground remains very tense.
It does. Okay, one last topic to cover. The Trump administration's decision to revoke temporary legal status for a lot of migrants from Latin America.
This is a big one. Over 500,000 people are going to be affected by this.
Yeah, they've been told they have to leave the U.S. by April 24th. These are migrants who came in under the Biden administration's CHNV program.
Which Trump suspended as soon as he took office.
Right. This program allowed people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to come to the U.S. if they had sponsors here. They could stay for 2 years and work legally.
The idea was to provide a legal pathway so people wouldn't try to cross the border illegally.
Exactly. But the Trump administration says the program didn't work.
And now they're kicking all these people out.
It's not entirely clear how many of them have managed to get some other kind of legal status since they arrived. But yeah, a lot of them are facing deportation.
This is going to have a huge impact on a lot of families.
It is.
Yeah.
And while the official notice says some people might be allowed to stay on a case-by-case basis, we don't know what the criteria for that will be.
And I'm sure there will be legal challenges to this decision.
Absolutely. And we're talking about a lot of people. Haitians, Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, hundreds of thousands of people in total.
And it doesn't stop there. The Trump administration is also thinking about ending temporary protected status for about 240,000 Ukrainians who came to the U.S. after the war started.
So yeah, a big shift towards more restrictive immigration policies.
It seems like every day there's a new headline about Trump doing something controversial.
He's certainly not fading into the background.
Okay, so to sum up all that we've talked about today, we've got political turmoil in Turkey with that arrest of a major opposition figure, a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza with no end in sight, and former President Trump shaking things up on the world stage, from Ukraine to U.S. immigration policy.
It's been a whirlwind of events.
It really has. And these stories are all connected in a way. They show how political events in one country can affect international relations, how difficult it is to get reliable information from conflict zones, and how the actions of powerful countries can have a ripple effect around the world.
It's all part of this complex global tapestry.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to consider. With all the different narratives and perspectives out there, how do we, as informed citizens, make sense of these complicated situations and develop a nuanced understanding of what's really going on in the world? It's something to think about as you continue to follow these stories. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, stay informed and stay curious.
And stay safe out there.
Very true.